Have you ever stopped to look at the multi-billion-dollar industry of modern superhero movies, the MCU, the DCEU, and the dozens of movies and TV shows that all rake in so much money, and ask, where did this all begin? Well, the complete answer is too big to answer everything in this intro, but I can tell you where one specific and important thread did come from. Because before the MCU and the DCEU, there were film and television adaptations ranging from Marvel cartoons of the 90s to primetime shows like Lois and Clark, the first X-Men movies, even the iconic Adam West's Batman series from the 60s. But, after all, these are comic book characters, so they all started as illustrations on a page. And even though they all seem kind of equal to us now because they've been around for decades, they were all introduced one at a time. In fact, the comic that gets credit for being the original superhero appearance was a newspaper strip in 1936 that introduced the Phantom. 2 years later, Action Comics in their first issue introduced everyone's favorite son of Krypton, Superman. And less than a year later, so third to ever do it, we were introduced to the one that is of interest to us today, when in May of 1939, Detective Comics, issue 27, introduced a new kind of hero. This one wasn't new just because of a secret identity. Both the Phantom and Superman wore uniforms, but this one was different in one important way. Our intrepid hero, when he wasn't busy fighting crime, was busy keeping up appearances as one of the richest men in Gotham. Yes, in 1939, Bruce Wayne, aka the world's greatest detective, aka the Batman, first graced the page. And if we dig into the story of the creation of this character, as the story goes, in the early stages, one of the co-creators handed a stack of scripts to the other, and on top of the scripts were images taken from a 1920 film called Mark of Zorro. And Mark of Zorro was based on a serialized story that had come out a year earlier, in 1919, about a rich Spanish-American named Don Diego de la Vega who fights corruption in early 19th century Los Angeles. So don't be thinking of LA as a big metropolis, this is way before that time. But in order to protect his identity, De la Vega wore a mask, and one addition that was not in the original story that the filmmaker added was the famous Mark of the Z that the hero carved with his sword to tell people he had been there. And I'm positive that once you learn our story today, you'll see all the evidence you need to know the tie-ins, but there is confirmation from the biographer of Douglas Fairbanks, the director of that 1920 film Mark of Zorro, confirming that Fairbanks added that Mark of the Z and played up the effeminate daytime dress and socialite attitude of De La Vega's real self due to a character that came out less than 20 years earlier, decades before Superman or the Phantom, the first true story of a hero who used a disguise to conceal his secret identity. That book, of course, was the Scarlet Pimpernel. Do I have to say more? I'm Jameson Olson. You're listening to Becoming the Main Character, where we retell the greatest fiction ever written through the lens of the characters and their choices to see what we can learn from these fictional characters for our non-fiction lives. Let's get started. A surging, seething, murmuring crowd of beings that are human only in name, for to the eye and ear they seem naught but savage creatures, animated by vile passions and by the lust of vengeance and of hate. That is word for word the opening sentence, and dang does it pack a punch. Let's hear that again and just let the strong loathing of the narrator sink in. It's rare that narrators express emotions this strongly, but this book is different in one big way than most we've ever read, a reason I'll explain much later on. A surging, seething, murmuring crowd of beings that are human only in name, for to the eye and ear they seem naught but savage creatures animated by vile passions and by the lust of vengeance and of hate. During the greater part of the day, the guillotine had been kept busy at its ghastly work. All that France had boasted of in the past centuries, of ancient names and blue blood, had paid toll to her desire for liberty and for fraternity. It was to be seen every day, for those aristos were such fools. They were traitors to the people, of course, all of them, men, women, and children, who happened to be descendants of the great man who since the Crusades had made the glory of France, her old noblesse. Their ancestors had oppressed the people, had crushed them under the scarlet heels of their dainty buckled shoes, and now the people had become the rulers of France and crushed their former masters, not beneath their heels, for they went shoeless mostly in these days, but beneath a more effectual weight, the knife of the guillotine. The narrator continues explaining that the guillotine played no favorites. Old men, young women, even tiny children. One day it would even demand the head of a king and his queen. But they then pose a question. Is this not how it should be? Are the best rulers of France not the people? For hundreds of years, the average citizen of France had worked and starved as the lavish lifestyles of the court carried on, ignorant of how awful conditions were for anyone without a title. And so, is it not right that any nobles who have not already been imprisoned or beheaded should hide and cower from the wrath of the people? That they should try to flee France because the aristocracy had no place here any longer? Ah, yes, it was more fun when they ran, anyway. The absolute thrill of catching a terrified comte or comtesse as they tried to have their cake and eat it too was one of the best ways to rile up the mobs to a fever pitch. The vindication on their faces as they found a new guest to have a date with Madame Guillotine was horrifying, but also exciting. The Committee of Public Safety made sure to post guards at every gate out of Paris to monitor the merchant carts and other workers who had need to venture out of the city daily, making sure that no noble man or woman could get away with just throwing on a costume of dirty clothes and escape the justice of the People's Republic of France. They'd seen it all. Men would wear women's clothes, women would wear men's. They'd put their children in rags, marquises, dukes. It didn't matter the rank. They seemed quick to imitate the people they disdained so much once their lives depended on it. If they could get through the gate, their odds of escaping to England or some other nearby country where they could be out of the grasp of the Republic went up significantly, which is why the gates were so closely guarded. One Sergeant Bibot had a reputation for sniffing out a noble in sheep's clothing. He was like a cat in the kitchen prowling for little mice who were trying to get their cheese. Sometimes when he was in a cruelly playful mood, he would toy with them, let them think they had deceived him, even let them take a step outside of the gate so they might think they had done it before sicking his men on them. But it always ended the same. The disguises were ripped off and they were dragged through the streets as cheers and jeers from citizens of the Republic filled the streets. Today, in particular, 100 heads had already rolled, but the bloodlust remained. Sergeant Bibot was sitting on a barrel by the barricade this fine September afternoon. He was not only faithful in his duty, but he took great pride in it. Why shouldn't he? Both Robespierre and Danton had both commended him personally for his zeal. He was responsible for at least 50 nobles being knelt under the blade. But this day, even Bibot was not in a great mood, because the word was that more and more nobles were escaping with each passing day. No one knew exactly how, but one of his fellow sergeants had been sentenced to the guillotine himself when it was discovered that an entire family of nobles had escaped through his gate undetected. Now, when I say no one knew exactly how, it's true that the means of escape were unknown, but there were stories of who was making this happen. These nobles had foreign help. A band of Englishmen who, for some reason, decided that their favorite sport should be risking their own lives to save these traitorous aristos from the justice of the Republic. Meddlesome. That was the best word to describe this band. Little was known about them except that their leader was fabled to be cunning and daring unlike any other man. His name and identity were a secret, but he developed a nickname due to one strange little thing that kept happening. These Englishmen didn't find it satisfying enough to just help the aristos escape. They would often leave correspondence that would reach its way to the Committee of Public Safety, where they would announce their exploits, stating who they had just helped save by escaping through the gates. And each one of those letters was signed with a drawing of a red, star-shaped flower native to England. And so this meddlesome Englishman was dubbed with a nickname he shares with that flower, the Scarlet Pimpernel. Because of these troubles, the guards had been doubled at every gate, and a bounty had been placed on the Scarlet Pimpernel's head of 5,000 francs to any man who captured him. Many people felt confident that it would be Bibot who would collect that bounty. Bibot spat on the ground as he thought about this annoying Brit, and how his fellow Sergeant Grospierre had been a fool to let an entire family get away under his nose. One of Bibot's soldiers asked him how such a thing could even happen. And Bibot begins to tell the story as he's heard it, about a cart that was mixed in with a number of other merchant carts that left town every evening. They were allowed out because they had to go to collect the produce and other goods that would be sold in town the next day. So every day, a number of merchant carts would come and go. They were typically inspected, and this cart was not altogether ignored either. It was driven by an old man, and the cart was full of casks. Grospierre's men checked most of the cart, but they didn't do an absolutely thorough check. Saying this made Bibot's men groan at the obvious mistake from the now dead sergeant for not checking every single barrel. But Bibot just laughed because he knew what came next. 30 minutes after that cart had passed through the gate, a captain of the guard with a mounted squad of a dozen soldiers came up demanding to know if the cart had been let through, and when Grospierre said yes, the captain cursed at him and said he would hang for this, demanding to open the gate, because that cart contained the Duc de Chailly and his family. The driver, who had appeared as an old man, was the Scarlet Pimpernel himself in disguise. Bibot's men groaned again at this part, but he smiled even more because the best part of the story was still coming. The captain shouted at his men to catch the escapees, and Grospierre stood there dumbfounded at the mounted patrol as they tore off through the gate. At this point, Bibot was laughing so hard his men had to ask what was so funny. He chuckled a bit more until he calmed himself down and said, "Those aristos were not in the cart, and the driver was not the Scarlet Pimpernel." "What?" his men exclaimed. "No," Bibot said, "the captain of the guard was the damned Englishman in disguise, and every one of his soldiers was an aristo." Quote, "The crowd this time said nothing. The story certainly savored of the supernatural, and though the Republic had abolished God, it had not quite succeeded in killing the fear of the supernatural in the hearts of the people. Truly, that Englishman must be the devil himself." It was getting close to sunset, which meant the last merchants would be heading out soon, so Bibot prepared himself for a few more inspections. There were carts lining up to leave. Most of them were regulars who he had come to recognize the faces of. Mostly women who drove the carts. The men were in the fields or in the market. Bibot noticed one old woman that he did not recognize. She held a horsewhip that had a string of curly hair tied around the handle. The old woman stroked the hair with her bony fingers and laughed. "I made friends with Madame Guillotine's lover," she said with a coarse laugh. "I was promised I could collect more tomorrow, but I don't know if I shall be back tomorrow." "Why is that?" Bibot questioned. "My grandson has the smallpox," she said, pointing her thumb back at her cart. "Some say it's the plague. If that's the case, I won't be allowed back in." Bibot had instinctively stepped away from the cart at the mention of smallpox. "Curse you!" he spat at the old woman. The crowd followed suit and backed away from the cart. The old hag just laughed and called Bibot a coward for being afraid of an illness. Bibot shouted at her to get moving and to leave her plague-stricken brood outside of the city walls from now on. The woman laughed coarsely again and whipped her old nag as the wheels of the cart began to roll. The other carts were inspected, and Bibot was preparing to be relieved of his duty for the evening when a captain of the guard arrived. He was breathless. "A cart," the man said, gasping for air. "What cart?" Bibot asked. "An old hag driving a covered cart." "There were a dozen of those," Bibot protested. "The one who said she had a son with the plague," the man said impatiently. Bibot said he did remember that. "You let her go?" the captain shouted. Bibot's cheeks flushed purple, and the captain continued to shout. "The Comtesse de Tournay and her 2 children were in that cart. All of them had already been condemned to death." Bibot, feeling a chill down his spine, dared to ask, "And the driver?" "Sacré tonnerre," the captain sighed. "It was the Scarlet Pimpernel himself, you idiot." Man, what a grim start to the story, huh? Now, the French Revolution is a big enough deal that I'm sure you know some things about it, but unless you actually study history actively, or maybe are French yourself, odds are you only know a handful of surface-level facts like I did. And since the Revolution is not only the setting, but almost a character in the story, I thought it would enrich all of our lives and experience learning this story to understand more of the core points about this very messy time in history. Because as an American, when I think revolution, I think great success, birth of a nation. And yet the French Revolution is marred with so many tragedies, and the outcome wasn't nearly as clean. So here is a BTMC primer that will surely upset some history nerds who feel like I leave out some very important details. The French Revolution came about as the exploding point after hundreds of years of the aristocracy, aka the ancient regime, devolving from being the warrior class of nobility into a cushy, pleasure-seeking crowd of out-of-touch rich people who couldn't care less about the working man. So you had the royal family at the top, the aristocracy, or aristos, as the book calls them, and it is just at this point in my research that I looked into the etymology of aristocracy, and it turns out it's Greek, and aristokratia means ruled by the best. So aristos literally means the best. But during the revolution, the Republic used aristos more like a slang term against the ruling class than out of respect. But that was wild to me. Terms like nobility are obviously elevating the class above the common man, but to realize the term aristocrat literally is just calling them better than feels like a bold move. But until a revolution comes, I guess you can get away with whatever you want against the working class. Anyway, back to the setup. You had the royal family, the aristocracy with all of its levels of dukes and barons and counts, etc. Then you had the church. And then below that were everyone else. There were tiers within that, tradesmen, farmers, urban workers, etc. They were all considered the lowest caste of commoners, essentially. In the 1780s, France was in financial trouble. They had been funding expensive wars, including the American Revolution, so thanks for the help, guys. But there were others, and King Louis XVI was all but bankrupt. And when a king is broke, he typically raises taxes. But where things got really messy was the fact that the aristocracy, the nobles and the church, they were all exempt from paying taxes. So all tax revenue came from the poorest people of the nation, and the citizens were already at their limit. Because on top of these raising taxes, they were also paying tithes and dues to their feudal lords. The peasant class began to bubble, and things reached a fever pitch when, in desperation, Louis called an assembly of the estates general. An assembly that hadn't met in almost 200 years. This was a group that was supposed to bring representation of all French citizens together in the sight of the crown. There were representatives of the aristocracy, the church, and the Third Estate, which was representative of over 90% of the population of France. The goal of this meeting was to come together to figure out how to solve the financial crisis. But the problem was, even though the Third Estate was representing over 90% of the population, they only got one vote, the same as the aristos and the church, which meant they kept getting outvoted 2-1. And at a certain point, the Third Estate decided they weren't being treated fairly, and they should have their own meeting called a National Assembly, where they would eventually take what is commonly known as the tennis court oath. Named this because it was taken at a venue for a sport that is similar to what we now call tennis. The vow they took was to not disband until there was a constitution written up to give a voice to the common man. I'll give you one guess how King Louis responded. Troops were assembled to break up the reformers, and he dismissed a finance minister who had actually been sympathetic to the plight of the common man. And this was the straw that broke the camel's back. On July 14th of 1789, we get Bastille Day, when Parisian citizens stormed the Bastille prison fortress looking for weapons and breaking out the prisoners, and they went as far as to kill the governor and parade his severed head through the streets. At this time, a number of French military even joined the mob because they were commoners themselves. So while the American Independence Day celebrates the signing of the Declaration of Independence, Bastille Day is about remembering when a mob of citizens stormed a fortress to kick off the revolution, which definitely sounds more metal, if you ask me. Less than a month later, the National Assembly abolished feudalism, declaring liberty and equality for all. King Louis, of course, refused to sign it, and his family were held prisoners. At one point, they tried to escape their imprisonment, which actually was around the timeline of this story, and were eventually subjected themselves to the guillotine in 1793, after this story. So the author very strategically places the window of this story before the king was beheaded, but while the Republic had taken full control and was eliminating the aristocracy at their pleasure. The opening chapter of this book is literally just called Paris, September 1792, as a way of letting us know exactly where in the timeline we find ourselves right now. The king is still alive, but we are already a few years into the rule of the Republic. Now, so much more happens that I'm not going to go into because this is just a context section for our great story. We're not here to dwell on the revolution, but I do want to quickly note how the revolution eventually devoured itself and why it got really ugly. Under the Republic, the Committee of Public Safety, which feels like a very PR name for a group that basically is the thought police from 1984. But this committee carried out the will of the Republic under the leadership of, namely, Citizen Robespierre. Oh yeah, that was a big deal in the Republic, that everyone, in order to be equal to each other, everyone was just called citizen. They had outlawed the aristocracy, so it didn't matter how rich you were or anything about your background, you were a citizen as much as I was. No one was to be considered above another. And so even the leader of the Republic, Robespierre, was known as Citizen Robespierre. And that's not even close to where the changes ended. They made some really bizarre choices, most of which to me feel like they were done for no other purpose than to prove that this was a different France than under the king. The church was swapped out for a state-sponsored group that basically tried to get people to believe in a god because Robespierre thought full-on atheism was destabilizing to any population, but to completely strip away the church and its influence. The most curious detail I found was the attempt to implement a 10-day week with 10-hour days and 100 minutes per hour. But at this point, if you want more details, go find some history podcasts who can do a complete dive into the French Revolution. Because at this point, you have almost all the context I think you need to understand where we're at. The only other detail I want to share is that the darkest part of the revolution was a period known as the Reign of Terror. The Terror takes place roughly in the same window as this story, and what it is in history is a 10-month period where thousands and thousands of people were executed by the revolutionary government, many for no crime more than being accused of being enemies of the Republic. An earlier and more lethal version of cancel culture, to say the least. The early revolution was marked with a number of issues that were founded in failed policy and poor rule, but they attempted to cover up a lot of it by simply claiming there were sympathizers to the crown who were interfering and that they should be killed. But if you look down the road of history, this ended with Robespierre himself being sent to the guillotine. And the Republic continued to be so unstable that it would be only 5 years later that a French war hero by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte will return from a campaign in a foreign land, look at the mess that his home nation was, and say, I'm going to fix this myself. So, I think it's very interesting that our author sets the story when she does. The revolution is in full swing, but the tension to possibly the worst year in French history is just mounting right now. A tension that is evidenced in this novel, which means we're ready to dive back in. We jump to a new setting and new faces. It's an inn close to the shore of Dover, England, called the Fisherman's Rest. It was a dreary and rainy late afternoon, but the fire was warm inside, and the conversation and laughter made it even more hospitable. The innkeeper's daughter, Sally, is busy serving the men who are drinking inside. Sally is pretty enough to draw in the locals and get them to spend their coins, so she makes sure to smile at them often enough to keep them coming back. Her father, Mr. Jellyband, yes, you heard that right, the name is Jellyband, was a jovial innkeeper. He liked to spend his evenings with his pipe, talking with the patrons of his food and drink. Many of them were his friends, so it was just like hanging out with the boys, except they paid you for the privilege. There is one thing that has not changed since man has become civilized, and it's that if you get a room full of middle-aged men together, they're going to discuss matters like politics and foreign policy. And this was a strange time in England, knowing how nasty the situation was across the channel in France. Because we're in a time where Englishmen, as the narrator notes, whether they were noble or common, all viewed the continent of Europe as nothing more than a den of immorality, and the rest of the world outside of Europe as nothing more than unexploited lands governed by savages and cannibals. Mr. Jellyband had engaged in small talk with some of the more regular customers about whether or not English leadership should get involved with the mess in France, but he kept his eye on Sally as she wove in between tables, dropping off beers and food with a smile. He was proud of her for how she worked because she brought in a lot of money, and as his only child, she would one day inherit this place. But he would always watch cautiously if it looked like she was genuinely flirting with anyone and not just putting on a face for some coins. He had much grander designs in mind for her than to marry some common barfly. He was noticing just such an instance when he saw her chatting with one particular young man that made him cautious. He ordered her to go back to the kitchen and make sure that Lord Tony's supper was almost ready. This was followed by questions from some of the locals about if Jellyband was expecting special guests this evening. And indeed he was. His friend, Lord Anthony Dewhurst, was supposed to be bringing some recently escaped French nobility by. along with some other English lords like Sir Andrew Ffoulkes and maybe others. Mr. Hempseed, one of the most frequent and most talkative locals, started up about why he doesn't know why Englishmen are getting involved with saving them frog eaters. But Jellyband's eye was elsewhere, because there was one table in the darker part of the tavern where two strangers sat listening. They had a half-played game of dominoes on their table, but they seemed to be taking in the scene of these Dover men yapping about foreign affairs. One of them, with a subtle smile on his face, responded to the windbagged opinions of Mr. Hempseed, who had just finished stating that he thought those French refugees were likely spies and were a threat to England. The patrons of the Fisherman's Rest were discomforted by the cool manner in which this stranger talked. He was confident and yet elusive. Most of them turned away to not have to look into his eyes. But in an effort to be a good host, Mr. Jellyband engaged with the man, laughing at his dry comments. They exchanged jabs, which culminated in the stranger toasting his host, saying it's clear he's sharper than 20 Frenchmen, and with a drink and a cheer, the other locals returned to their talks and laughter, allowing the strangers to meld back into the shadows. Now, England was not completely unaffected by the revolution. Trade had obviously been impacted, and the stories of the cold-natured murders of women and children made most Englishmen's blood boil. Every foolhardy chap had found himself at one time or another wishing he could have a go at those murderers. There was one story in particular of the mob killing and mutilating a princess who had been turned over to bloodthirsty radicals by a tribunal after she refused to denounce her friend, the Queen Marie Antoinette. This story had just reached the shores of England, and it left a sour taste in their mouths. But despite common criticism of the events in France, English leadership didn't dare interfere. They, of course, tried the more diplomatic ways to get involved, but when those didn't result in anything, the men, names such as Burke and Pitt, sat on their hands and watched in horror as the death toll climbed and nothing seemed to improve. These, of course, were the types of topics that Mr. Jellyband and his friends loved to debate, with the confidence that they would know what to do were they in the shoes of Mr. Burke or Mr. Pitt. FYI, Pitt is the Prime Minister at this time in England, and Burke was just a more prominent member of Parliament who took great interest in the French Revolution. Sally came running back into the room and excitedly told her father that she had seen Lord Antony's horse in the yard. The next moment, the door opened and a man stepped in, his coat and hat dripping with the steady rain that had been falling that afternoon. Lord Antony Dewhurst was a charming fellow. Within moments of entering, he'd kissed Sally on the cheek, commenting on how she got prettier every time he saw her, and his booming voice had filled the room with compliments to his host and friend, Mr. Jellyband. He was the epitome of an English gentleman, well-bred, smart, but quote-unquote, not too much brains to spoil his temper. He had a laugh that rang out, and he was a good sportsman to boot. And as a man who was known to visit France often, he had spent a number of evenings at the Fisherman's Rest. Since this will be relevant to the story, for those of us who don't already know the specific geography of England and France, Dover is a coastal city in the southeast of England, which has the closest port to Calais, which is the westernmost port in France. It's basically 20 miles of the English Channel between the two. So Dover is a key point in traveling between the two nations. Lord Antony took in the room and saw that there were many faces he recognized. The older men, like Hempseed, who were friends of his host, and the younger men who he knew came there for Sally. But he was quick to clock the two strangers playing dominoes. His eyes tried to study their shadowy faces as he engaged with Mr. Hempseed, knowing that it wouldn't take much to get the old man going. And as predictable as always, Hempseed dove into commenting on how ugly things were in France when their government would stoop as low as they would to kill such innocent people. Lord Antony agreed and stated that they were fortunate enough to have a few escapees coming here that evening who had evaded the clutches of the mob. He glanced at the strangers again as he said this. They stayed quiet and played their dominoes. Mr. Jellyband saw the concern in his patron's eyes and walked over, whispering his assurances that he had talked with them and that they were as loyal to King George as Sir Antony himself. Lord Dewhurst takes him at his word and asks if anyone else is expected to stay at the inn this evening, because, of course, all the men here eating and drinking would go home to their families at the end of the night. But Antony wanted to know about any other overnight guests. Jellyband assures him that no one objectionable was staying, only Sir Percy Blakeney and his wife. Lady Blakeney? Lord Antony said in astonishment. Yes, my lord, Jellyband said. Something about her brother going back to France on Sir Percy's yacht, and she's come to send him off, I think. Tony laughed and said he hoped in that case that the dinner would be the best that they could offer. Lord Dewhurst had written separately to make sure things were ready and safe for the main party, but it was only a few minutes later that a group of 4 came in through the door, drenched and shivering. There was the Comtesse de Tournai, her daughter Suzanne, and her son, the Vicomte, or Viscount, who were accompanied by Sir Andrew Ffoulkes, who had been their guide out of France. Sir Anthony rushed over to introduce himself and welcome the Countess and her children to England. In a strong French accent, the Countess thanked him. Tony continued to exchange polite conversation with the Comtesse. Sir Andrew Ffoulkes, who had journeyed with the 3 of them, took off his coat and tried to engage in conversation with Tony and the Comtesse, but his eyes were fixed on Suzanne, the daughter. He blushed when the young woman's eyes met with his own. "So this is England?" Suzanne said with a nervous smile. Andrew had exchanged words with her before, but the cloak and dagger nature of their escape had kept him from truly getting to know her. He flushed, but still a gentleman and trained in the art of conversation, he wittily replied, "A bit of it, mademoiselle, but all of it is at your service." She smiled back at him. There was a warmth in her face that made his heart beat. But just then, it was announced that dinner was ready, and pulling his young friend to the side, Sir Tony teased Andrew about already falling for the girl. Most of the locals had either left or made room so that a large table could be set for the noble guests. Sally bustled around, setting plates and bringing out dish after dish. The young Vicomte couldn't take his eyes off of her any more than the local fisherman could. The young man made a comment that, "If this is England, I am of it satisfied," as he ogled Sally unashamedly. Lord Tony laughed and said, "This is England, my young friend, but I pray do not bring your loose foreign ways into this most moral country." While this happened, Sir Andrew Ffoulkes and Suzanne continued to steal glances at one another in silence. All in all, it seemed that these refugees were quickly able to put the horrors of their time in France behind them, with one large caveat. That being that the Comte himself, their father and husband, was still trapped in a land surrounded by a bloodthirsty mob that wanted his head. Quickly, the travelers dove into the delicious meal, having gone almost a full day without food. The mood was cheerful and relieved. The English gentlemen played perfect hosts representing their nation, even in this humble seaside inn. Everyone was so delighted that no one took notice of the 2 strangers finishing their game of dominoes. One of the men stood up, with his back to the crowd, blocking view of his table, while his companion slipped under a bench into a position where he was not visible to anyone. The first stranger then turned, strode towards the front door with a loud "good night" to pull the focus away from his companion hiding, and he left. No one had noticed this ruse, but all were somewhat relieved at the notion that the strangers were gone. They just assumed that the second one had already exited when the first one said his goodbyes. The mood continued to rise as the French aristos could breathe easily for the first time in years. The young Vicomte toasted to King George's good name, winning favor among the locals. Antony returned the grace with the toast to bringing the Comte de Tournai here safely soon. The Countess smiled politely but nervously whispered that she barely dares to hope at the idea of seeing her husband again. Antony assured her his toast was not some idle statement, and Sir Andrew chimed in saying that the Comtesse should trust her English friends to bring him here as well. She smiles and thanks them again for their daring and cunning, commenting how she would never have left her husband's side if she didn't have her children to think of. The table fell silent, sympathizing with a woman who even now in the free air of England was plagued with fear. The 2 English lords felt her pain, but in an attempt to hide their feelings, which it's noted was the way of the lords of the time, the only thing they succeeded at was looking incredibly sheepish. Suzanne picked up the conversation, telling Lord Andrew that she has full confidence in his ability to bring her father home. Andrew was quick to deflect, saying he was nothing but the hands, that their great leader was the one truly responsible for all of this. "Your leader, monsieur?" she asked. Even the hint of evoking the Scarlet Pimpernel caused a stir among the French at the table. The Comtesse expressed her desire to thank this Pimpernel personally, but Antony, with a smile, said that that was impossible because the Scarlet Pimpernel works in the dark. His identity is only known to his sworn followers. Suzanne laughed at such a fearsome and honorable man having such a plain and harmless flower as his moniker. The Scarlet Pimpernel held no prestige among the world of flowers. It was so common it was barely better than a weed. "Why does he go by such a droll name?" Suzanne asked as she glanced at Andrew. The young man's eyes, that up till now had been rarely pulled off of Suzanne, were now staring off, the light of the fireplace glimmering in his gaze as he repeated the lore of his beloved leader. The Scarlet Pimpernel, mademoiselle, is the name of a humble English wayside flower, but it is also the name chosen to hide the identity of the best and bravest man in all the world, so that he may better succeed in accomplishing the noble task he has set himself to do. Is it true, the Vicomte interrupted, that every time a royalist escapes to England, the public prosecutor Fouquier receives a paper with the mark of the little red flower on it? That is true, Antony chimed in. So he received one of them today, for us. Undoubtedly, the gentleman said with a wink. The de Tournay family all smiled at the thought of how angry this prosecutor would be, and how even he might be in danger of the ruthless leadership of the rebellion for letting them slip away. The Comtesse spoke. The one thing I cannot figure out, good sirs, is why should you get involved at all? Why spend your money and risk your lives for us French men and women who are nothing to you? Antony confidently and smugly replied with nothing more than, Sport, madame, sport. His contagious smile filled the room as the locals smiled approvingly. We are a nation of sportsmen, you know, and at this moment no sport is more in fashion than to pull the rabbit from between the teeth of the hound. The Comtesse objected, saying there has to be another reason for such a noble and risky effort. But Antony continued his claims, saying if there is a better reason, he hopes she can find it for him. Quote, as for me, I vow, I love the game. It is the finest sport I have yet encountered. Hairbreadth escapes, the devil's own risks. What's not to love? The Comtesse shook her head in disbelief. Suzanne and her brother smiled in complete awe at the boldness of Antony's statements. But the Comtesse soon became lost in thought about how everything had transpired in the last few days. Going from complete despair to a mysterious letter arriving with the mark of the little red flower promising them a way out, thoughts of her escape, how her and her children hid under a pile of turnips and radishes in a covered cart, driven by a woman who looked like an ugly demon who had the hairs of beheaded nobles wrapped around her whip handle. But now, here she was, a peaceful inn on the English seaside. This was the first time she felt like she could breathe. She could only hope to not wake up, realizing it was all a dream. She came back to reality, hearing her daughter asking how large this League of the Scarlet Pimpernel was. Sir Andrew explained that there were 20 of them all told, 1 to command, 19 to obey, with a sworn vow to protect the innocent. May God protect you all, messieurs, the Countess said lovingly. He has done that so far, madame, Andrew said with a smile. She marvels at how these foreigners are so caring and gracious when, in France, your own countrymen couldn't be bothered to look out for you. She cited one particular example where an entire family of the Marquis de Saint-Cyr had been killed just because they were denounced by one French woman, a Marguerite Saint-Just. Marguerite Saint-Just, Antony said, choking on his food slightly. He shot a glance across the table to Andrew, who was already staring back at him with a nervous expression. The Comtesse wasn't completely shocked at these reactions. After all, Marguerite Saint-Just was a famous actress from France who had recently married one of the richest men in England. You know her? The Countess asked. Know her? Why, yes, we know Lady Blakeney. All of us do. Suzanne interjected that she had gone to school with Marguerite. They had even visited England together to study the language years ago. It was hard for her to believe that her friend Marguerite was capable of anything quite so evil. You say she denounced the Marquis de Saint-Cyr? Andrew asked, seeking clarification. There is no chance of a mistake on that, the Countess said with a stone-cold expression. Have you not heard the story? We've heard it, madame, but I'm afraid most here in England did not put much stock into it. You see, her husband, Sir Percy Blakeney, is the richest man in England and a close friend of the Crown Prince of Wales. He leads both fashion and society here. It was as if a wet blanket had been dropped on the evening's festivities. Lord Antony stepped away, feeling extremely uncomfortable now, and he asked Mr. Jellyband when he was expecting the arrival of Lord and Lady Blakeney. Any moment, my lord, Jellyband whispered. And before Sir Tony could even get back to his seat, the sound of a 4-horse coach arriving was heard outside. A stable boy opened the door to announce that Sir Percy and Lady Blakeney were arriving. The Comtesse had jumped to her feet, exclaiming that she would not be in the same room as the traitorous Lady Blakeney. Voices outside of attendants rushing around filled the air. "Good day, Sir Percy," or "Welcome, your ladyship," were heard from inside. Everyone froze as the first through the door was a woman in layers of cloaks to protect her from the rain. She was now inside, just around the corner from the dining room where they all sat. As servants helped unwrap her, the Comtesse tried to get Suzanne to leave the room with her immediately, but her daughter wanted to speak with her old-time friend. Jellyband, trying to be a good host, stood awkwardly blocking the line of sight of Lady Blakeney, giving the Comtesse a chance to escape unseen. "My good man," came a smooth and calming feminine voice, "what are you standing in my way for? Let me go into the fire. I am perished from the cold." And in a moment, she was now inside. Quote, "There are many portraits and miniatures extant of Marguerite Saint-Just, Lady Blakeney, as she was then, but it is doubtful if any of these really do her singular beauty justice. Tall, above average, with magnificent presence and regal figure, it is small wonder that even the Comtesse paused for a moment in involuntary admiration before turning her back on so fascinating an apparition. No more than 25, her beauty was at its peak, her delicate features complemented by her confident and charming personality. Marguerite glanced around the room, smiled to see Tony and Andrew, but then, with a gasp, she greeted her old friend Suzanne, who she was not expecting to find here by any means. She took in the Comtesse as well and started to walk over, asking them how they found themselves in England. Tony and Andrew watched in horror, knowing the full context of the relationship between these women. The Comtesse seemed to be biting her lip in hatred of this woman, who she saw as a willing hand in the slaughter of her kind. Suzanne and Marguerite chatted briefly while the Countess fumed before she finally erupted. "Suzanne, I forbid you to speak to that woman!" She placed her hand on her daughter's arm to pull her back. She had chosen to say this in English, which felt like a choice. She wanted the entire room to understand what she had said. The innkeeper's daughter gasped at the scandal she was witnessing. Marguerite was married to Sir Percy. She was friends with the Prince of Wales. How dare any woman speak to her this way? Tony and Andrew also didn't know what to do. Seemingly, the only person that was not completely upended by this declaration was Marguerite Blakeney herself. Her face had gone white, but otherwise she stood tall and graceful in the face of such a rude accusation. She turned to see the shock and speechless expressions of all the men in the room before replying to the Comtesse, but cheekily calling her a citizen since the aristocracy had been outlawed, asking what seemed to be the issue. The Countess simply said that they were in England now and she is entitled to forbid her daughter from being friends with anyone she chooses, and she beckoned again for Suzanne to follow. Marguerite stood like a statue as she watched Suzanne, looking at her nervously, before running over, kissing her on the cheek, and then sheepishly following her mother out of the room. Lady Blakeney blew a kiss in the direction of the French women before turning her attention to her gentleman friends Tony and Andrew with a mocking tone, repeating the Comtesse, "Suzanne, I forbid you to speak to that woman." All in attendance were quick to laugh at the joke, except for one. The charisma of Lady Blakeney was obvious as the fear left all of the men's faces. Tony joked how the Parisians must hate Sir Percy for having stolen her away. She shrugged gracefully before saying, "It is impossible to hate Percy for anything. Even the Comtesse de Tournay couldn't resist his simple charms." But the one who was not impressed, still in the room, was the young French Vicomte de Tournay, who had not followed his mother and sister. He was filled with indignant anger at this woman for her disrespect. But before he had a chance to defend his family name, quote, a pleasant though distinctly inane laugh was heard just outside the door, and in a moment, an unusually tall and very well-dressed figure had stepped in the doorway. Sir Percy Blakeney, as the chronicles of the time inform us, was in this year of grace 1792, still a year or two on the right side of 30, tall above the average even for an Englishman, broad-shouldered and massively built. He would have been called unusually good-looking, but for a certain lazy expression in his deep-set blue eyes. And that perpetual inane laugh, which seemed to disfigure his strong, clearly cut mouth. It was nearly a year ago now that Sir Percy Blakeney, Baronet, one of the richest men in England, leader of all the fashions and intimate friend of the Prince of Wales, had astonished fashionable society in London and Bath by bringing home from one of his journeys abroad a beautiful, fascinating, clever French wife. He, the sleepiest, dullest, most Britisher that had ever set a pretty woman yawning, had secured a brilliant matrimonial prize, for which, as all the chroniclers aver, there had been many competitors. At this time, we also get a more proper introduction to Lady Marguerite, saying, quote, Marguerite Saint-Just was from principle and by conviction a republican. Equality of birth was her motto. Inequality of fortune was, in her eyes, a mere untoward accident, but the only inequality she admitted was that of talent. Money and titles may be hereditary, she would say, but brains are not. And it's a recurring point made over and over again in this book about the odd pairing of the dull but rich Sir Percy and the fabulously talented and intellectual Lady Marguerite. Some were merely perplexed by it. Others could appreciate the irony that the sharpest and most intelligent woman in France had ended up with a complete fop like Percy Blakeney. It must be the money, right? In fact, the narrator even takes the perspective of how the average person might look at their relationship when she wrote, quote, how that stupid, dull Englishman ever came to be admitted within the intellectual circle which revolved around the cleverest woman in Europe, as her friends unanimously called her. No one ventured to guess. Put simply, their relationship confused everyone, but they seemed happy enough despite their differences. Percy's dim wits were often attributed to his mother, who had gone mad when he was just a boy. In fact, Percy's father had moved the family out of society into a plain living house so he could care for his afflicted wife away from the rumors and pressures of society. And that, in part, was why Percy was so rich now, because instead of spending significant sums on upkeep of an estate and servants, etc., Sir Algernon, which is his father's name, chose a simpler life while his wife was alive, meaning the majority of the fortune of the Blakeney family continued to grow and grow. Percy's fashion was not just peak, it was fashion. Whatever he wore became the new trend. And so despite everyone knowing that he was hopelessly stupid, he had his place in society between his money, his trendy attire, and his generally delightful mood at any given moment. But what most did not know on the surface is that the seeming marital bliss of the past year was just a ruse, and that the relationship between them had faded as the stark differences between Percy and Marguerite were starting to show. No one seemed to pity Sir Percy, but in the words of our narrator, he didn't seem to need any pity. Even though his wife struggled to not make jabs at him in public, pointing out his dim wits to everybody, it's almost as if he was too stupid to register her insults. But anyway, as much as everyone adored Marguerite, everyone treated Percy well enough, so why should he worry? And on this particularly rainy September afternoon, Percy is introduced to us dressed in lace and tight breeches. His coat shaped his strong and tall frame beautifully, so he was the picture of English manhood. If he simply never spoke and never laughed, you'd assume he was anything but the silly boy that he turned out to be underneath. In this hall of Mr. Jellyband, Percy took in the scene, greeting his friends Tony and Andrew. Zounds, my dear fellow, did you ever see such a beastly day? Demmed climate this. When the room remained silent in wake of the Countess's outburst, Percy, who was ignorant to what had just happened, demanded to know what was going on. Marguerite answered, saying nothing worthy of disturbing her husband's equanimity, only that she had been insulted. Egad, you don't say, my dear. Who was the bold man who dared to tackle you, eh? Tony had opened his mouth to explain, but before he could, the young Vicomte de Tournay had jumped from his chair and announced that it was his mother who had offended the Lady Blakeney, and although he cannot ask Percy's pardon on behalf of his own mother, he can offer the lord the usual reparations between men of honor. The young Vicomte's gaze was on fire, which was in stark contrast to Percy's mildly lazy eye and indifferent temperament. Percy towered over the young Frenchman, but Percy also disregarded the message from the boy's words and asked to know where he'd learned to speak English, claiming that his accent is demmed marvelous. And turning his back to the young man, he commented to his friends that he can't speak French anywhere as close to that good. The Vicomte grew heated as he could see Lord Blakeney did not take his offer of a duel, because in coded terms that was what he meant by the only honorable thing to do, and Percy had not taken this seriously. I said I offer you my sword, monsieur. Percy looked down at the Vicomte, astonished at the fiery nature of the young man, and said, Damn it, young man, what's the good of your sword to me? Quote, what the Vicomte thought and felt at that moment when that long-limbed Englishman treated him with such marked insolence might fill volumes of sound reflection. I love that sentence. In simpler terms, the young Frenchman had a lot of angry thoughts about Percy's seeming mistreatment of his attempts to be honorable. "A duel, monsieur!" he shouted. "Oh, that's what you meant," Percy said. "I never fight duels. Demmed uncomfortable things, aren't they, Tony?" The young Frenchman had heard rumors that English nobility had lost interest in duels as a mark of honor, but he considered striking the man for the dishonor he seemed to be dishing out to the family de Tournay with everything he said. Marguerite lightheartedly asked Tony to keep the peace between the two men, saying that Sir Percy had the ability to provoke all the saints in the calendar and yet keep his temper all the while, meaning he is so oblivious that he is upsetting even the most good-natured person, while he himself has no clue that he was the cause of the emotions. Tony had quickly gone to the Vicomte's side, assuring him that his stay in England will go better if he doesn't start it with assaulting one of the most powerful men in the country. The fog of duty cleared from the Vicomte's face, and he apologized, saying if Percy has no griefs about his wife being insulted, then he has no reason to need to defend his family's name. "I withdraw myself," he said as he stepped away. "I do," Percy said stuffily. "Withdraw yourself over there. Demmed excitable little puppy." He leaned over to Sir Andrew and joked that if this was the kind of specimen the Scarlet Pimpernel was bringing over from France, then his advice would be to drop them in the middle of the channel. Marguerite jests that Percy should remember he himself has imported a bundle of goods from France, meaning herself, and he smiled good-naturedly at his wife and claimed that he had had the pick of the market, however, and his taste is unerring. She protested that his taste is perhaps stronger than his chivalry, seeing as how he could not be bothered to defend his wife's honor. "Odds life, my dear, be reasonable," Percy said. "Am I to make my body a pincushion for every little frog-eater who doesn't like the shape of your nose?" The room laughed along with Percy at this comment, and Jellyman, the innkeeper, began to bring out hot drinks and food for the newly arrived visitors. Marguerite asked about her brother and was told he was arriving shortly with the skipper of Percy's yacht, the Daydream. "Yes," Percy exclaimed, "and Armand, her brother, can join us for a drink before he sets off." But Marguerite said she'd prefer a private farewell, and now that the rain had stopped, she will meet with her brother outside. Percy didn't argue with her, but rather he opened the door for her himself once she had her coats back on. She left without even acknowledging him in any way. It was only Andrew Ffoulkes who noted the look of intense longing and hopeless devotion on Percy's face as his wife exited the room. Lady Blakeney was standing on the edge of the hill that looked over the harbor. She could see her husband's yacht, the Daydream, ready to sail her brother Armand back to the dangerous land of their birth. She had a bad feeling about him leaving her. Ever since their parents had died when they were children, Marguerite and Armand only had each other. Their bond was strong, and their love for each other was deep. She eventually saw her brother walking up the hill towards the Fisherman's Rest, and she moved to meet him, tears of joy on her cheeks as she cried out, "Armand!" The skipper said they needed to set sail in about 30 minutes, and he went inside to see his Lord Percy, leaving the two Saint-Just siblings alone together. She begged him to reconsider leaving England. He told her that their country needs him. "But they are going too far, Armand. We are both Republicans who desire liberty and equality, but surely you agree they are going too far." Armand tried to stop his sister from saying such things. Even though they were in England, he glanced around to make sure no one heard her speak such anti-revolutionary things. Marguerite said how sometimes she wished her brother didn't have such lofty virtues, so he wouldn't feel compelled to risk himself like this. She begs him to be cautious, and he tells her he will be as safe as he can manage. Armand gets a serious look on his face before saying that his sister doesn't have to answer if she doesn't want to, but he has been curious for some time if Percy himself knows about her involvement in the denouncement of the family of the Marquis Saint-Cyr. She laughs an ironic laugh and says that yes, she told him what happened after they were married, hoping that she could gain his trust. "You told him all the circumstances of what really happened?" She chuckled again. The circumstances didn't matter, because he'd already heard the nasty rumors. So the moment she admitted to having any involvement with the Marquis, he had assumed the worst to be true. "And now I have the satisfaction, Armand, of knowing that the biggest fool in England has the most complete contempt for his wife." "But Percy loved you," Armand said in disbelief. "Loved me? Ha! Well, I thought at one time that he did. I know everyone thinks I only married him for his money, but the truth is, at one time, He worshipped me with a curious intensity that captured my heart. I had never loved before, but Percy awoke something in me. The fact that he was slow and stupid almost made him more lovable. A clever or ambitious man would naturally have other interests, but a fool, I thought, might be capable of worship and nothing more, and I was ready to be worshipped and give nothing but tenderness in return. But that all changed after he learned about the Marquis Saint-Cyr. Armand's heart went out to his sister. She had been young and maybe misguided when she married this Englishman, and he knew that she did not deserve the label of denouncer. The circumstances around what had happened were beyond her control. But what did puzzle him about her was the fact that she seemed so heartbroken over the fact that the richest idiot in England did not love her like he used to. He saw the way they interacted. Percy always indifferent and unattentive, Marguerite sharp and at times insulting. They didn't seem like they made each other happy. It was as if each still felt an intense love for the other, but the lack of trust meant they had built a barrier to keep them from being close with one another. He hated leaving her like this, and he also hated the fact that he had to keep so many details about the truth of his visit from her, because the narrator gives us a hint saying that his sympathies might have changed since they had last spoken of their allegiances. Marguerite's heart also ached that she had to keep her true feelings a secret even from her brother, the only constant she had had her entire life. But very quickly, it was time to say goodbye, and she watched Armand and the skipper descend down to the Daydream, staying outside until the ship was too small to follow. Once the Daydream was out of sight, Marguerite turned back to the inn where her husband and his friends were drinking and laughing. While still some ways away, she could hear his laugh above all others. It was a stupid laugh, inane even, and yet it had a charming effect. She briefly felt bad about how she treated him. She didn't consciously want to mock him, but the bitterness she felt about how things had turned out between them, mixed with her sharp wit, often led to harsh comments sneaking out from time to time, even hoping to wound him. She thought back to the day that it had changed. It had only been one day since their wedding. Their courtship had been quick, extravagant, and nothing but a perfect love story. But it was the day after their ceremony where she felt she must address the rumors to him about her involvement in the death of the Marquis de Saint-Cyr. She had told him how she had not outed him, but rather had only made some statements to men that she considered friends, men who turned out to be informants against the Marquis, sending his family to the guillotine. In fact, the truth of the matter, and since this is a third-person narrator, we can more reliably trust that this is the truth. And the truth of the matter was that Marguerite's involvement with the Marquis de Saint-Cyr started years before that, when her brother Armand had fallen for the Marquise's daughter. His blind enthusiasm for the woman who was well above his birth led to him writing a love poem and having it delivered to her. The next evening, he was attacked by a group of the Marquis's lackeys, beaten within an inch of his life because the Marquis was offended at the thought of a commoner like Armand even considering he could have a shot at his privileged daughter. That had happened several years ago, years before the Great Revolution had even started. Marguerite had never forgotten the blind hatred that had been displayed towards her brother, however, and she had held the Marquis in contempt in her heart for years. And although she would never have gone to the lengths of purposefully reporting him to authorities in hopes of him being killed, that didn't keep her from talking disparagingly about him to her close circle. So when she inadvertently heard a story about how the Marquis was in correspondence with Austria, which was a treasonable offense, she repeated the rumor, not thinking anything more of it than satisfying her own need to be able to think poorly of the man. But it was less than 24 hours later that the Marquis had been arrested along with his family, his home had been searched, and letters to the Austrian emperor were discovered in his house. That same day, he was condemned to die. The leadership of the revolution had publicly hailed Marguerite as a hero to the cause, but she had never wished to be so closely tied to the killing of a family. She was horrified at how powerless she felt to save the Marquis. She told this all to Percy, believing his blind love for her would accept her innocence in how ugly things had gotten. But, to her dismay, that confession fundamentally changed their relationship. Only one day into their marriage. At first, he didn't seem to have a reaction at all. He just became very quiet and introspective, almost as if he didn't understand what she had told him. But since that day, they had slowly been drifting apart. His love for her seemed to be tossed aside like a poorly fitting glove. In fact, the lack of emotion from him was what she hated most, to the point that she found herself realizing she thinks the reason she makes such sharp comments about him in public was because for him to be angry at her would feel better than this apathy. And yet, no matter how many backhanded compliments or sly digs she laid at his feet, he received them all with the same passiveness, the same witty acceptance that he always did. And yet he never treated her poorly. She had all the trappings and luxuries that she would have had if he was still her devoted lover. The only difference was the invisible wall that stood between them. Marguerite was jolted from her thoughts at the realization that she could hear someone moving towards her in the darkness. She started to walk quickly to the door of the Fisherman's Rest, the warm light glowing through the windows and the laughter echoing into the night. But she was intercepted by a dark figure before she reached the door. A calm but stiff voice called out, "Citoyen Saint-Just?" She let out a little cry in shock, hearing her name from the shadows, but she looked up, taking in the dimly lit face of the stranger, and let out a laugh as she reached out to hug him. "Chauvelin!" she cried out. "The very same, citoyen, at your service." Citoyen just means citizen in French, which, as I already said, was the way the Republic tried to emphasize that everybody was equal. So everyone just called each other citizen regardless of position. It is a gendered term. So citoyen, which, take my French pronunciation for what you will, but citoyen is the feminine version, and then citoyen is the masculine version. Chauvelin is described as near 40, clever, shrewd-looking, a curious fox-like expression on his face with deep, sunken eyes. The narrator fills us in that he was the stranger in the pub who had been talking with Mr. Jellyband earlier. Although Marguerite didn't consider herself close friends with Chauvelin, the former social queen of Paris was happy just to see a familiar face on her new home turf. Marguerite expressed her pleasure to see him and asked what he's doing in England. He tells her that he is here on official Republic business and that he has come to her in hopes that she may be willing to assist him, if it's not too beneath a lady of her position to do something as plebeian as work. Marguerite asks in surprise what she could possibly be of use to the needs of the Republic, and Chauvelin, with his searching eyes, asks if she is familiar with the Scarlet Pimpernel. She laughs. In fact, the Scarlet Pimpernel was something of a folk hero in English society at this time. The English aristos applauded the daring deeds of the man who was set to spare their fellow nobles from the guillotine. It's one of the only things people talk about these days. Chauvelin looked disgruntled to hear this masked entity being praised like this. So, in that case, I am sure you are aware, citoyen, how this hidden man is the most bitter enemy of our Republic of France. I thought France would have more bitter enemies than him, Marguerite said playfully. Chauvelin's face was set with a sort of patriotic glare as he reminded her that she is a daughter of France and should be more concerned with being part of the cause that would rebuild their great nation, and that as the wife of a wealthy noble in England, she is uniquely positioned to potentially learn information leading to the discovery of the Pimpernel's identity. He tells her that he has been tasked by the Committee of Public Safety to find the Pimpernel and stop the hemorrhaging of French aristos to the English countryside, because it was not good for the morale of the citizens to see the people who oppressed them escape justice. And rather than try to capture the League one by one, Chauvelin is set to cut off the head and be done with it. While a commoner herself who held no love for aristos of her homeland, she also loathed the violent methods that the young republic, who Chauvelin represented, had chosen to use in establishing itself. She cringed at the thought of the guillotine. On top of that, she had secretly been entranced by the romance of the League of the Scarlet Pimpernel. The idea that these young English lords risked their own lives for nothing more than the love of their fellow men and a belief that no one should be so cruelly treated made her heart melt. And the image of their leader, some vigilante who masterminded the entire operation. She had developed a certain kind of crush on the idea of him, especially since her Percy didn't express love for her anymore. Her breath quickened at the thought of this man, and knowing that her countryman was now asking her to discover who it was and turn him in to French authorities, was too much for her to think about. They stood in silence for some time before Chauvelin spoke again. "Find him for France, citoyenne." She tried to excuse herself by showing how ill-equipped she was for such a mission. "How am I supposed to find such a man?" she asked. "What could you even do to stop him? He's an Englishman. Unless caught in the act on French soil, you can't do anything about it, can you?" Chauvelin, again with a grim face, said, "I will take my chances on that. We can apologize for any misunderstandings to the British government after the fact. Even pay a compensatory fee to any grieving family left behind." "I could never be part of such a villainous plot," she cried in a low voice. "You would prefer to be insulted by every French aristocrat who comes to this country?" Remember, Chauvelin had been in the room during the altercation between Marguerite and the Comtesse. He'd been holding that bullet in the chamber in case he needed to get her attention. She glared at the French citizen even as her cheeks flushed, and after a pause, she said, "I refuse to do any dirty work for you or for France. I can defend myself," she said, and she turned and reached for the door, as Chauvelin, calmly, almost too calmly, said, "This is not your last word, citoyenne. We will meet again soon, perhaps in London." And with that, she threw open the door and rejoined her husband and his friends. Chauvelin stood on the stoop for a moment, looking out at the sea as he took a pinch of snuff. A thin, almost wicked smile breached the corner of his lips. A couple hours later, Percy and Marguerite departed, with Percy driving his coach of 4 thoroughbreds in the light of the moon-filled evening. With the cool breeze on her cheeks, Marguerite quite enjoyed these night rides, even though they were miles and miles from home. But wrapped in her furs, sitting next to Percy, it was her favorite form of solitude. But her mind raced with thoughts of Chauvelin, his mission, his almost threatening promise to see her again, and she thought of the Scarlet Pimpernel more as well. Most of the guests of the Fisherman's Rest had either left or gone to bed. Sir Tony and Andrew were the only men still sitting by the fire in the dining hall. Alone, for the first time, they could discuss the details of the mission that liberated the de Tournay family. Andrew reported that it went perfectly smooth. Tony teases him about how the young lord seems to be taken with the daughter Suzanne. Andrew blushes, but doesn't actually refute the claims. Andrew says how he actually met with their leader, the Pimpernel, briefly in Calais, and laughs about how he was dressed at the time. As an old market woman driving the cart, he cuckolded at the thought of their brave and noble leader hunched over in his old hag's costume, yelling, "Down with the aristocracy!" in order to fit in with the French rabble. Tony also laughed at this thought. "That man's a marvel," he said. In more hushed tones, they addressed the rumors that the Republican government had tasked a man named Chauvelin with finding the details of their league and pulling them out by the roots. Andrew says that in his brief encounter with the Pimpernel in France, he had said that they will have to meet less frequently and make their communications even more coded now. "We are not to reach out to him ever. When he wants to speak with us, he will make himself known." Tony nodded. Things really did seem to be getting more dangerous with each successful mission. Andrew pulled out a pocketbook and retrieved a paper that he began to read before passing it to Tony. It was a message from their adored leader. The two men were so engrossed in reading the thoughts of their leader by the dim light of the fire that they didn't notice the figure who emerged from under a bench at the back of the room like a snake. Anthony noticed a smaller slip of paper on the ground that must have fallen out of Andrew's pockets. His friend didn't know what it was, but upon examination, it was a second message from their chief. But before they had a chance to memorize the contents of the papers and burn them, as was protocol, the door, which they had thought was bolted, was thrown open by the shadowy figure, and a group of men rushed in, capturing Andrew and Tony in a bewildered state. They were gagged and tied back to back. Once the commotion had died, another figure came in from the night air. He wore a mask and stood silently as the others secured the knots on the Englishman. "All safe, citoyen," one of the men reported as he handed the 2 pieces of discovered paper to the leader. The 2 Englishmen were hauled away to be interrogated as the fox-like man removed his mask and smiled. "Not a bad day's work, on the whole," he said, satisfied as he looked over the letters, delighting himself to see the signature of Armand Saint-Just, Marguerite's brother, on one of the letters. "Armand Saint-Just, a traitor, after all," he murmured. And then he added between clenched teeth, Now, fair Marguerite Blakeney, I think that you will help me find the Scarlet Pimpernel. We cut to a gala night at the Covent Garden Theatre in London some days later. The entire theatre was packed as the crowd was eager to hear one of the most popular operas of their time, Orpheus by Christoph Willibald Gluck. In attendance were the Prime Minister, Mr. Pitt, the Prince of Wales, which, if you're like me and don't fully understand the titles of British royalty, at least at this time, the title Prince of Wales does indeed mean he is next in line to be the King of England. We peer into the theater box of Lord Grenville, who is a Foreign Secretary of State, where people's curious glances kept darting towards a thin and shrewd-looking man with long black hair and no wig or powder. Lord Grenville didn't seem too eager to have the man there, but out of his civic responsibility, he was hosting the Frenchman that evening. We cut to another scene inside, seemingly quickly adjusted to the life of an aristocrat again, only on English soil. The Comtesse de Tournay was both having a delightful evening and a hateful experience. Delightful because she and her children were being hosted by incredible English families who expressed great sympathy for her and treated her like one of their own. But a hateful experience because she had not expected to have to see Chauvelin here in London, not to mention looking up at Lord Blakeney's box to see Marguerite, whom she hated, sitting there, smiling as if she wasn't a traitor to France. She had asked her friend and hostess why the English government would host a snake like Chauvelin, and she was told that no matter how much England may disapprove of what's going on in France, it would not be smart for them to refuse a delegate of their government on a diplomatic mission. Huh, the Comtesse scoffed. He is no diplomat, but a sly fox who is here to do nothing but spy. No doubt he is here to cause mischief against the Scarlet Pimpernel. I am sure, she said through pursed lips, if he needs an ally, he will find one in Lady Blakeney. Marguerite sat in her box, dressed in the most cutting-edge fashion, which was one perk of being married to Percy. He not only had the money, but the connections to the best designers in all of Europe. Chauvelin watched her intently from his position in Lord Grenville's box. Marguerite hadn't even noticed him. She was enchanted by the music. The story of Orpheus tore at her heart and made her feel something that real life had not been able to replicate in some time. Something that she felt that no one else seemed to be able to articulate. Percy wasn't there with her. He was off socializing with other men who came to the opera not to watch, but to talk to the other disinterested husbands. So when a knock came at the box door, she assumed it would be one of her friends and told them to come in without even turning around. Her heart froze when she heard that voice say, "A word with you, citoyenne." She whipped around to see Chauvelin showing himself in. She tried to play her dread off as nothing but surprise, and Chauvelin apologized for the interruption, saying that this would be his only opportunity to catch her alone that evening. "Aren't you going to be at Lord Grenville's ball this evening?" she said. "I'll give you 5 minutes there." "Ah, but 3 minutes of privacy here is all that I require. You're going to want to hear this as well." She didn't like how that last sentence sounded. A shiver ran down her spine, and she looked into his pale, fox-like eyes, and her blood chilled at the dark calm that he conveyed. "Is this a threat, citoyen?" she asked. "No, fair lady, merely an arrow shot into the air." She paused before asking what he meant to say. "It seems your brother, Saint-Just, is in peril." Marguerite froze. She had gotten word that Armand had arrived in France safely, but hadn't heard anything in the last 2 days. Marguerite, who, as you will recall, was considered one of the greatest actors in all of France, chose to not show her fear, and laughed it off, saying that this must be one of Chauvelin's imaginary plots, and that she already has one of those playing out on the stage for her entertainment. But she did not move, and he did not smile. His gaze was set. After she fell silent, he continued, "I have news that will interest you. The other day I asked if I could rely on you, and you gave me your answer then. Many things have happened since then." "Will you get to the point?" Marguerite asked politely. "Just one moment, citoyenne. Shortly after our last meeting, I obtained some papers about the schemes to escape those French aristocrats, the Tournays, and more, all organized by that arch-meddler, the Scarlet Pimpernel. I regret to inform you that one of the papers, taken off a Lord Andrew Ffoulkes, was written by your brother. It shows that he is not only an enemy to France, but an ally to the League of the Scarlet Pimpernel." She had guessed this is where this was headed, but not showing her emotion at the confirmation was still a monumental task for the young actress. And yet, she did not flinch. She knew Chauvelin was too earnest of a man to lie about such a thing. He was too proud of his role in the new government, which held lofty ideals, to stoop to lies in order to manipulate. She smiled with a laugh. Didn't I say it? Some imaginary plot of yours. Armand, in league with the enigmatic Scarlet Pimpernel. I underestimated your imagination, citoyen. Chauvelin leaned in sternly. Let me make my point clear. Your brother is guilty beyond any hope of pardon. Marguerite sat straight, fanning her face as she fought back tears. She gathered herself before saying calmly, Chauvelin, my friend, let us understand each other. It seems clear that you wish to force me to do some sort of espionage in exchange for my brother's life. Is that not so? He scoffed playfully, saying he wouldn't use such ugly language to describe the situation. But that is your intention, she asked, looking at him defiantly. She may not be able to control the situation, but she would not let him think for 1 second he had control of her. My intention, he said, is that you win a free pardon for your brother by doing me a small service. And what service is that exactly? He then pulled out a very small slip of paper, presumably the one that had fallen out of Fawkes's pocket at the inn. Chauvelin read it aloud. Remember, we must not meet more often than is strictly necessary. You have all instructions for the second. If you wish to speak to me again, I shall be at G's ball. The paper was signed with the drawing of the Pimpernel. No matter how much she could try to feign ignorance, she knew what this meant, what Chauvelin intended. The Scarlet Pimpernel would be at Lord Grenville's ball after the opera, and he was forcing her to help him unmask the man. Chauvelin then told her how the two lords who had been captured had been released that morning, more like they just woke up to find their jailers gone and the doors unlocked. No doubt they will come looking for their leader at the ball, so they can warn him that someone is onto them. Marguerite was frightened as she looked into the man's eyes. She couldn't tell if it was love of country or the thrill of the hunt that made his eyes shine wickedly as he spoke. He told her to watch for him at the ball. He may have instructions for how she can help him, but for now, simply pay attention to everything that Lords Andrew Fawkes and Anthony Dewhurst get up to that night. Note every man they speak to and report back to him. Find out who he is, and I pledge the word of France that your brother will be safe. He had used all the right language to make this sound like nothing more than a win-win situation for both of them, but Marguerite was too sharp to not know what this was. He was holding a knife to her throat. She had no choice. No doubt Chauvelin had notified the Committee of Public Safety about Armand, and if he hadn't already been captured, he would undoubtedly never be allowed to leave France again. If I help you with this, will you give me that letter of my brother's? If you help me catch my man, the letter will be yours tomorrow. But I may be powerless to help you, regardless of how willing I might be, she said. That would be terrible indeed, Chauvelin said with a mocking smile. For you and for Saint-Just. The two of them turned back to the opera and sat in silence for a time. The final arias filling the air as Marguerite's mind wandered. Could she find a way out of this? Could Percy help her? Did he still love her enough to bother helping her? If nothing else, he seemed to like Armand enough that he might help for his sake. She glanced over at Chauvelin, who smiled and nodded as he looked into the finale of the performance of Orpheus, as the daring lover was reunited with his fated wife to live happily ever after. But before the absolute finale, there was a light rap on the door, and Percy Blakeney, all 6 foot plus of him, stepped into the box. He spoke to his wife, even as he eyed the unexpected guest. Your, chair is outside, my dear. I suppose you will want to go to that damned ball. Oh, excuse me, Monsieur Chauvelin, how delightful to see you here. The two men shook hands. Percy then turned and bluntly asked, Are you coming, my dear? Loud shushes from the boxes on either side of them reprimanded the man for taking them out of the performance. Marguerite would have typically hated leaving early, but she would do anything to get away from her loathsome manipulator, and so she stood to leave, saying that she was ready. She told Chauvelin that they would see him at Lord Grenville's ball, and she left. Chauvelin once more gave a thin, satisfied smile as he took a pinch of snuff. No matter how much she tried to not look disturbed, he had gotten to her, which meant he would have what he wanted. So something that's just kind of a fun fact for longtime listeners of the show who know that I've both done an episode on the story of Orpheus and how much I love that Greek tragedy. It's one of the best myths of all time. And so if you were astute enough and you noticed that I actually said something about Orpheus being reunited and living happily ever after, that should have triggered something of like, wait, that's not how the story goes. But I actually looked into this, and it turns out this opera by Gluck changed the ending slightly in order to make it more palatable, perhaps. And it plays out much the same as the true myth, where he leads her up through Hades and she dies because he turns around and looks at her. The key difference being that the goddess of love, who's moved by Orpheus's plight, revives his dead wife, and they are able to escape the grasp of death. So that's a fun little tie-in from another story we've covered on the show, but it's also interesting context that this was the opera chosen to be going on in the background in this scene, in this story. The idea of a man who would go to the ends of the world to save the woman he loves not only has some crossover with the idea of this League of the Scarlet Pimpernel who risk themselves to save others, but it also might line up with the romanticized version of the Scarlet Pimpernel that Marguerite holds on to, comparing him to the daring tale of Orpheus. And, as a matter of fact, the music that's been playing in the background of this scene is the very opera that we've been talking about. The ball was the biggest social function of the year. It happened every autumn, and despite nobles traveling all over Europe most of the summer, everyone made sure to be back in time for Lord Grenville's ball. The Prince of Wales was expected to be there, as well as all the names worth knowing. Lord Grenville himself stood at the top of the staircase where his guests entered, so he could greet them one by one. Off to the side, his guest out of duty, Chauvelin, leaned against a table, observing. His plain black suit stood out against the lavish, seasonal gowns and apparel of the English lords and ladies. No one really paid him any mind, and he didn't care. He was not there on a social call. And it was a good thing he didn't care either, because the news of the Reign of Terror had reached England, and most citizens looked down on the French Republic with disdain. Some of the more political guests, like Mr. Pitt, had at least come over to shake his hand and exchange a pleasantry before feeling like their duty had been filled. But within a minute, he would find himself standing alone again, observing every guest and every conversation. But Chauvelin was not the man to trouble himself about these social amenities, which he called mere incidents in his diplomatic career. He was blindly enthusiastic for the revolutionary cause. He despised all social inequalities, and he had a burning love for his own country. These three sentiments made him supremely indifferent to the snubs he received in this fog-ridden, loyalist, old-fashioned England. He really felt like every French aristocrat was an enemy of France. So he sneered at the French aristos that he saw here tonight who had escaped from his country, as if he was watching war criminals be treated as innocent bystanders. He was caught up in his thoughts of his obligations to the Republic to bring down the deviant Scarlet Pimpernel when there was a commotion in the crowd. He turned to the top of the staircase to see the Prince of Wales, accompanied by his friend Percy Blakeney and Lady Marguerite. The prince was in a salmon-colored velvet suit with gold embroidery. He had Marguerite on his arm, and Percy walked next to her in his cream-colored satin with lace coming out of every possible opening in his suit. Out of duty, Lord Grenville introduced the prince to Chauvelin. "Monsieur," the prince said smugly, "we will try to forget the government that sent you and look at you as our guest, a private gentleman of France, and as such you are welcome here." Chauvelin bowed, but before he could say anything to attempt to ingratiate himself to the prince, almost as a smack in the face, Lord Grenville whisked the prince off to introduce him to the Comtesse de Tournay, who was on the other side of the room. "Ah, yes, by all means," the prince said as he walked away from the French delegate. "She is one of the lucky ones, then." With Marguerite still on his arm, Lady Blakeney and the Comtesse de Tournay played a game of diplomatic chess in their greetings to each other. The prince was too aloof to catch wind of the dislike that these women had for each other. The Comtesse made a vow of devotion to her hero, the Scarlet Pimpernel, and the prince, noting Chauvelin standing to the side, joked that she should not name her benefactor in this company. But Chauvelin smiled, saying the name of the man is well known to France. "Ah, well, perhaps you know more about our national hero than we do," the prince said with a sarcastic laugh. "If you know his name, pray do tell. I'm sure all the women here tonight would be in your debt to learn his identity." With another diplomatic smile, Chauvelin dismissed the joke, saying he is as unknown to him as to any others. "What a pity," the prince said. "Here in England, merely saying his name makes all the female cheeks blush and male's imagination soar with the idea of being part of his merry band. We all feel a little proud to remember he is an Englishman." A small cheer erupted at this from those around the prince. Chauvelin just smiled and took it. He was too sharp of a fox to fall for something like a royal family member poking at him. He would contain his feelings even in the face of such a taunt. Suddenly, another laugh soared above the others. It was obnoxious. It was annoying. It was Percy Blakeney. "And we poor husbands," he said, "have to stand by while our wives worship a damned shadow." The whole room erupted in laughter, the prince louder than the rest, and with that the crowd broke off into smaller groups and went into various rooms within Lord Grenville's estate. Okay, here's a good time to point out a little fun fact about this book. I don't know off the top of my head how many of these I kept in and how many got filtered out or reworded as I was scripting, but this book is full of terms and exclamations that feel very odd to modern ears, like odds fish and gadzooks, lud, or la, things that sound comically silly for real adults and especially people in positions of power to be saying. But when you look into it a little bit, it turns out each of these phrases is basically just an encoded version of some form of religious epithet or exclamation. Lud or la pretty openly can be seen as Lord. Odds fish means God's flesh, and gadzooks means God's hooks or the nails that hung Christ from the cross. This type of language, known as minced oaths, is pervasive in this book. Now, anyone familiar with Christian commandments might guess that these phrases were invented to avoid breaking the commandment to not take the Lord's name in vain, and that was definitely the biggest underlying reason, but the implementation of how the state got involved is what surprised me. Because in 1606, so almost 200 years before this story takes place, English Parliament passed the Profanity Act, which would actually impose heavy fines on any actor, performer, or public speaker who took God's name in vain, meaning that playwrights and other performative artists took to crafting these minced oaths as a way of saying it without saying it. And although it may sound wild to think that hundreds of years later, things like zounds and egad were popular among social elites, what's even wilder is to realize we still do this today. Those words feel bizarre to our ears, but when you realize how hundreds of years from now, people hearing words like heck, dang, geez, dadgum, and others will also look at them as equally fictitious. And I know Percy didn't use one of those just now in the line that he spoke, but he is the greatest offender in this story in terms of using these types of phrases. But let's get back to the ball. The whole night was torture for Marguerite. Not only was she having to mask the pain and fear she felt for her brother, but as her only hope of saving him, this evening was full of her spying on her friends and fellow guests. Her nerves were rattled, and things got worse as she spent more time with her husband, realizing that his good-natured and lazy demeanor as a rich man who only did what pleased him vanished any hopes that she had that he would be capable or interested in helping her get Armand back. The moment she found herself alone with her husband, she felt the, quote, same feeling of good-humored contempt which one feels for an animal or a faithful servant, which made her turn away with a smile from the man who should have been her moral support in this heart-rendering crisis. At this moment, he was surrounded by a crowd who all politely listened to him recite a quite stupid poem he had written about the Pimpernel. The prince had thought it was the funniest thing and made him repeat it for the crowd. "We seek him here, we seek him there. Those Frenchies seek him everywhere. Is he in heaven, or is he in hell? That damned, elusive Pimpernel." The crowd erupted in applause, a mixture of equally dim-witted individuals with those who were smart enough to know better than to not approve of the silly games of the richest man in England. After they'd had their laughs, the prince took Percy into the game room for some friendly rolls of the dice, a game called Hazard. Percy never seemed to care what Marguerite did at social events, even if that was flirting with very handsome men. But tonight, she herself tried to remain disengaged from lengthy conversations so she could keep her eyes peeled for anything that could save Armand's life. She eyed the other guests who all seemed to be having the time of their lives, and she scanned every face for an out-of-place look or a conversation that seemed to be trying to not be heard, the more she hunted, the more she became engrossed in the search. Not only did she want to save her brother, but quite frankly, she wanted to know who the Pimpernel was. And she was in a unique position to possibly be the first non-league member to find out. He was here at the ball. That was a fact. Of course, she kept a closer eye on Fawkes and Tony Dewhurst than anyone else. They were her keys to success. Surely they would be desperate to warn their leader. At this particular moment, she was monitoring Lord Andrew Fawkes, who was standing just to the side of an entryway between rooms. He was leaning against the entryway, looking somewhat anxious. She got closer, but stood at an angle where she would not easily be spotted by him. Her eyes went wide as she saw Lord Hastings, another lord known to Fawkes and Marguerite's husband, walk past Andrew briskly, but her attentive eyes caught the moment that had been intended to go unnoticed. Lord Hastings, in passing, had slipped something into Andrew's hand. Fawkes stood there a moment longer before turning and heading through the entryway into the next room. Marguerite followed intently. Quote, "Fate is usually swift when she deals a blow." She was no longer Lady Blakeney. She was only Marguerite St-Just, out to save her brother's life. Nothing else mattered. So she didn't notice the odd looks she got as she followed Andrew, pausing and hiding to avoid his sight. The key to saving Armand's life could be 20 feet away from her, and that was all she cared about. She saw Andrew go into a hallway beyond the rooms of the party and slip into a door just to the side. Time for her to do some acting. She followed him in. At first, his back was to her as he held the note that had been slipped into his hand up to a candelabra. But he startled as he heard her, and he hid the note behind his back as he turned to face her. "Ah, the heat in the room was terrible," Marguerite said, fanning herself and acting faint. She even began to totter, and Sir Andrew rushed to catch her. He helped her to a chair where she leaned her head back, pretending to close her eyes. But through her squint, she watched Andrew sneak another glance at his precious note. She had to see what was on that scrap of paper. But even now, he was beginning to hold it to a candle so he could burn the evidence. She jumped up, snatched the note out of his hand, and held the burning paper under her nose. "Ah, how thoughtful, Sir Andrew," she said, even as the lord looked shocked and unsure of what to do. "Surely it was your grandmother who taught you that the smell of burnt paper is a remedy for giddiness." This was certainly not a real thing, but Sir Andrew didn't know any better. He just looked eager to get the paper back at all costs. She imagined he was extra frightened that the woman in possession of the paper was the supposed betrayer of the Marquis de Saint-Cyr. But she was quick to come up with her perfect distraction to put him at ease. "Ah, I see," she said. "You were not trying to remedy my giddiness. You simply wanted to burn this note. Who is she?" Andrew looked stunned at the question. "Whoever she is," Marguerite teased, "she is a lucky lady to have the heart of one as noble as yourself." He smiled, feeling a bit relieved that he was above suspicion, but he was still intent on getting the note back. So he reached for it and said that whosoever the lucky lady was, the note was his and he must insist on it being returned to him. Think, Marguerite, think how to look at the note without him knowing. He lunged for the paper, and instinctively she turned to avoid him, but quick on her feet, she exaggerated her movements to the point where she knocked some candles off of a table into a curtain nearby. "The candles, Sir Andrew!" she cried out. "Quickly!" Andrew rushed to put out the flames, and Marguerite snatched a quick glance at the note. She read a little more than a dozen words, which hadn't been burned yet, and saw the well-recognized flower as the signature. She crumpled the note back up in her hand just before Andrew turned back to her. She teased him again and said she only hoped that the note was from her dearest Suzanne, and shame on Andrew if it was from some other woman, while Suzanne clearly had feelings for him. And then she handed him the paper, telling him to finish burning it, which he did without delay. Once it was reduced to ashes, Marguerite, in an attempt to display a lack of interest in the real affairs of the note, asked Sir Andrew if he wouldn't enjoy exciting the interest of whoever the fair lady was that wrote the note by dancing the minuet with her. As Andrew walked Marguerite to the dance floor, the words that she had read ran on loop in her head. "Start myself tomorrow." The other part of that sentence had been burned by the time she read it. The other sentence said, "If you wish to speak to me again, I shall be in the supper room at 1 o'clock precisely." That was it. That was the intel. The Pimpernel would not only be setting off himself, most likely for France, the next day, but he would be in the supper room later tonight. Her cleverness was on full display, dancing with Andrew and appearing happy to be there while her brain worked out the complex choice of what to do next. Did she deliver this news to Chauvelin? Did she have any other options? After the dance, the reaction from Andrew settled her mind that he didn't suspect her of her true reasons for their interaction, and she tried to further put his mind at ease by inviting him to the party that she would be hosting later that week. The book called it a water party, which I should have guessed this, but when I looked it up, it literally basically is just a party on a boat. So since this is London, it was likely on the Thames River. Andrew thanked her for the invite, but said he may need to leave London the next day, and she expressed her wishes that he didn't go because no one can throw a ball better than him, and he would be missed on the bowling green. Just then, the prince arrived to offer his arm to Marguerite, saying it was time for supper, with a comment that her husband had wiped him out at dice. But his consolation prize is that he gets to sit with her at supper. "You have had bad luck tonight?" she asked with a smile. "Aye, most unfortunate. Blakeney, not content with being the richest among my father's subjects, has also the most outrageous luck. By the way, where is that inimitable wit? I vow, madame, that this life would be a dreary desert without your smiles and his sallies." Anybody at that supper table would never have guessed anything was wrong with Marguerite. She was never more adorable, and her husband was never more amusing. The Prince of Wales laughed until tears streamed down his cheeks at Percy's joke. On top of the entertainment, the food itself was delicious. Lord Grenville had the best cook in London. All that on the surface seemed great, but inside, Marguerite was in knots, filled with anxiety about what to do, knowing that time was precious. It was almost 12:30 now. Only 30 minutes to the anticipated meeting, and she still hadn't decided what to do. The meal ended, and most returned to the dance floor while the older guests debated if it was time to go home. Marguerite had found herself in a room, listening to some cabinet minister who didn't seem to mind that she wasn't the most attentive audience. He just kept talking. The battle raged in her mind until suddenly, acceptance. Fate, she decided, had already made the choice for her, it seemed. All that was left was for her to resign her own will. Armand must be saved at any cost. He was all she had, and she was all he had in this world. No matter how brave this anonymous hero may be, Armand must come first. She needed to get to Chauvelin, and quickly. There was very little time to save her brother now. She asked the cabinet minister if he wouldn't be so kind as to find her husband for her. The moment that man was gone, Chauvelin slipped into the room. Apparently, he had been waiting for the chance to catch up with his little spy. "Do you have any news for me?" Marguerite took a deep breath as she hoped that Armand would appreciate what she was about to do for his sake. She told Chauvelin about the paper passed between Hastings and Ffoulkes and how she was able to read most of it, delivering the news of what she had read to the citizen of France, who eagerly ate up every word she said. He immediately looked up at the clock, seeing he had 5 minutes until the expected meeting. She expressed her doubts about if Andrew may not have already warned the Pimpernel anyway out of caution, but Chauvelin said he had watched Ffoulkes since Andrew and Marguerite had danced, and that he had had no clandestine meetings or conversations. "But what if there are multiple men in the room?" she asked. "I will have one of my men tell every single person I find in there. If any of them leave for France tomorrow, we will know he is the meddlesome fool." He informs Marguerite that he too leaves for France the next day. One of the first documents he confiscated off of Ffoulkes mentioned an inn in Calais called Le Chat Gris, a place of no significance except that it may be a common meeting place for the League. He said the note also mentioned something about a fisherman's hut somewhere on the coast where the Comte de Tournay, remember the husband of the rescued family, is probably hiding out until he is rescued himself. "I must go," he said, exiting the room as he tingled with the excitement of narrowing his suspect list down. "But what about Armand?" she said anxiously. "I have not broken my word, citoyenne. The day I capture the Scarlet Pimpernel, your brother will be free." Alone, Marguerite sat with the weight of what she had just done. Fate had decided, right? It must have. How else could she have brought herself to do such a vile thing just now? When Chauvelin reached the supper room, it was almost completely deserted. The table still had plates and glasses and used napkins scattered all over. Chairs had been pulled back from the table into clusters of 2s and 3s, shadows of conversations between smaller groups. But it appeared he was alone. He smiled, just a little, in anticipation, rubbing his hands together. Who could possibly guess that such an unassuming scene as this could be the trap that would spring on the most notorious man in all of Europe? Fitting, that it should be such a plain and unheroic setting such as this, Chauvelin thought to himself. He began to imagine what this man would look like. The tales of his escapades had turned him into a legend, but oftentimes legends don't live up to the truth. This man had a group of 19 other lords who fulfilled his every order. His genius could not be denied, his tactics, his disguises. Despite hating him, Chauvelin was eager to meet him personally one day, preferably on French soil where he would have the power to detain and then decapitate him. But for today, he must remain unseen. He wouldn't be able to confront the man here. His goal was simply to identify anyone who shows up so they can track his movements. He surveyed the room, looking for his best option for a hiding spot when he noticed something he hadn't seen when he first walked in. There was someone there. How had he not noticed before? But as he stood absolutely still, he realized that the figure had not been noticed before because they were asleep on a sofa. The low, rhythmic breathing told the Frenchman everything he needed to know. He drew just close enough to make out that the tired guest was none other than the well-dressed, long-limbed idiot husband of the cleverest woman in all of Europe. Chauvelin watched him with a curious face. An almost pitiful smile crept upon him as he thought about this man that had the whole world, but was too dim to appreciate it. Very well, Chauvelin thought. If there is to be one man passed out in this room, a second might be the best disguise for someone wanting to spy on the secret meeting about to happen. So, without a sound, Chauvelin laid himself out on a sofa on the other side of the room from Sir Percy's unconscious body. He stretched out, closed his eyes, and began to mimic the breathing patterns of a sleeping man. And from here, he waited. And that is where we're going to wrap up part 1, everybody. Who is Chauvelin going to find in that supper room? On our way out today, I do have a takeaway, but maybe it's more of an observation. And it comes from the amount of time I've spent during this production process thinking about the French Revolution. What an absolutely wild time in history, right? And what is so tragic is that it may have had its roots in something really necessary in regards to change, but how quickly it got completely out of control and turned into something just as ugly, if not uglier, than the system that it was trying to overthrow. It started as a real grievance, centuries of oppression, of starving and being overtaxed, a ruling class that just didn't care about them at all. The descendants of knights and kings who had once lived a code of honor to protect the people had lapsed into an overindulgent bunch of apathetic hedonists. But when you look at what happened in only a handful of years during the violent overthrow, some estimates put it up over 300,000 people who were arrested, with over 17,000 being executed by the guillotine, with somewhere between 20 and 25,000, potentially more, dying in prison from poor conditions. And most of those weren't nobles, merely the very commoner that the revolution had swore to be championing when it started. But the revolutionary leaders had gotten a taste for blood, and blood became the primary way to fuel the fires. Because even though the Republican leadership were the ones who would formally condemn, any citizen could make an accusation. And accusations which at a certain point became almost the only thing necessary to send someone to the guillotine. And knowing that at times crowds would form to witness the deaths and even cheer, this is something much more twisted than seeking justice. Nietzsche wrote about this, and he called it the ressentiment, or resentment, but he did actually use the French term for it. What he addressed, if we apply it to the context of the French Revolution, would explain when the movement stopped being defined by what it was wanting to build and began focusing on the shared hatred of what oppressed it. It was no longer about fixing an unjust system. It was just about making sure the other party suffers. And now that you are in power, it can become intoxicating to keep flexing that power by punishing the other party more and more and more, all while still claiming to only seek justice, when in reality, it's more like emotional vengeance. What is so dangerous about this, when we look at examples in history, is that when you're on the inside, it's really hard to see this objectively. Robespierre didn't look at what he was doing as monstrous, sending people to death for little more than a whisper of treason with no proof. But that period isn't called the Reign of Terror because it was handled professionally. When the oppressed take power, It is a very tricky line between moving towards equality and becoming bloodthirsty revenge seekers. But this doesn't take something as big of a scale as a revolution. It can happen in relationships, friendships, or any other small-scale human interaction. When you keep score with a spouse and hold a mistake that they made years ago over their head just so it gives you leverage. When you try to find reasons to talk bad about a coworker because they complained about you to your boss once. This is a very relatable place that we can find ourselves in our own lives. Holding power over someone who we believe has wronged us. When you're in that position, do you seek objective justice with a capital J or personal emotional justice with a lowercase j? One can help the entire group move forward. The other just feels good for a moment, but then relatively quickly, the only power it has left is to destroy. Your life cannot be defined by getting back at the people who have wronged you. That is literally the definition of a villain in the hero-villain-victim framework that we use on this show. A villain seeks to make other people feel their pain, whereas a hero transforms in a way to make sure that pain is not felt again. And when I use that word transformation to describe a hero, it often is left open to interpretation. But in this instance, we have a real application of what that transformation looks like. It means transforming into someone who can absorb the pain they have felt and decide that the best move is to move forward instead of lashing out about the past. But if your identity is reactive, organized around the actions of an enemy rather than moving towards your vision, you've lost the plot. Absorbing mistreatment without needing to dish it back out is one of the hardest things you can do as a human being. Doubly so if the offending party did it on purpose. But that is quite simply the only thing that separates a villain from a hero. One is holding onto their wounds so deeply that they seek to make others feel what they felt, often inflicting worse wounds in the process. But the hero says, it stops here. The moment I lower myself to matching eye for an eye, I am no better than they were. There are plenty of stories about heroic figures who slip into becoming their own version of the villain, and if you pay attention, you'll be surprised how many of those stories, the transition moment starts with the hero giving in to the temptation to make a more wicked character feel pain, because it feels good. Just something to think about. We'll be back next week with part 2 of The Scarlet Pimpernel. What is Chauvelin going to find when the clock strikes 1? Come back to find out. If you want the full story right now, as well as additional content and bonus episodes, find the link in the description of this episode to sign up for the Protagonist edition of the show, where you get the whole story in one drop. If you like this episode, make sure to subscribe, leave a 5-star review, or like the video if you're on YouTube. Thanks to those of you who have subbed on the YouTube channel since the last time I asked for some help. I'll make the request one more time in case you missed it last time. If you listen primarily on podcasting platforms, but wouldn't mind helping me boost the numbers on YouTube to get more traction there, you can go to youtube.com/@becomingmain. I'll put that link in the description as well, so you can just click it, because the channel's small enough that you can't just find it necessarily by typing Becoming Main or BTMC in the search bar. But I do think I've started getting some more organic subscriptions because you guys told the algorithm to pay attention. So I appreciate you, and we'll catch you on the next one.